the price of preventing the next collapse. Every crisis leaves behind a scar, and every scar comes a question: how much protection is too much? After learning how to stop collapse from spreading, the system faced a quieter dilemma: whether preventing disaster was slowly changing the cost of progress itself. To understand why this matters, we have to return to the period after stability was restored. Safeguards worked. Failures were contained. Panic no longer spread unchecked. From the outside, the system looked healthier than it had in decades. But beneath that calm, a new tension was forming. Preventing collapse required caution. Caution required restraint. And restraint carried a price. Credit grew more selective. Risk-taking slowed. Institutions prioritized survival over expansion. These choices reduced volatility, but they also reduced opportunity. The system was safer, but it was also heavier. The early signs appeared in growth patterns. Innovation took longer to finance. New firms struggled to scale. Capital flowed toward proven structures rather than new ideas. This wasn't stagnation, but it was friction, the kind that builds slowly, quietly, and unevenly. The reveal began here. Stability was no longer free. It demanded trade-offs. Every safeguard that absorbed shock also absorbed momentum. Every layer of protection added weight. And while that weight prevented collapse, it also reshaped what success looked like. The system had learned how to survive disaster. It had not yet learned how to grow comfortably afterward. And that tension was only beginning to surface. As the system settled into its safer form, the consequences became harder to ignore. Stability reduced fear, but it also reduced urgency. Institutions became deliberate, cautious, and increasingly selective about where capital flowed. Risk was no longer something to manage creatively. It was something to minimize. This shift changed incentives across the economy. Projects that promised steady, predictable returns were favored. Ventures that required patience or carried uncertainty struggled to secure funding. Capital moved toward size, scale, and familiarity. Innovation slowed not because ideas disappeared, but because tolerance for failure narrowed. Banks felt the pressure internally. Stronger requirements meant more capital held idle, waiting for stress that might never arrive. Liquidity buffers protected against crisis, but they also limited flexibility. Decisions took longer. Approvals required more certainty. Safety came at the cost of speed. Markets reflected this new posture. Volatility declined, but so did dynamism. Price movements became restrained. Growth became incremental. The system no longer lurched forward, but it no longer surged either. Stability had smoothed the extremes, flattening both losses and gains. The public experienced the change unevenly. Established institutions benefited from predictability. Smaller players faced higher barriers. Entrepreneurs found it harder to access early funding. The system felt secure, but less welcoming. Progress continued, but it favored those already inside. This was the early conflict emerging. Preventing collapse had altered the system's character. Protection was working, but it was reshaping ambition. The question was no longer whether safeguards were necessary. It was whether their cumulative weight was quietly redefining what the economy could become. The reveal deepened. Stability was not neutral. It redistributed opportunity. And the cost of safety was no longer abstract. It was visible in what failed to happen. The tension was building between resilience and renewal, and that balance had not yet been found. The tension reached its emotional peak when the system began confronting its own limitations. Stability had been achieved, but at a price that could no longer be ignored. Growth slowed not because demand vanished, but because pathways narrowed. The economy felt protected, yet constrained. Institutions faced a dilemma. Pushing forward meant accepting risk that safeguards discouraged. Standing still meant falling behind in a world that never truly pauses. Many chose caution, not because they lacked vision, but because deviation felt dangerous and the system optimized to prevent mistakes. This shift altered behavior at every level. Banks favored established borrowers over emerging ones. Investors demanded certainty before commitment. Innovation was asked to prove itself before it could exist. The future was required to justify itself in advance, a standard it could rarely meet. The emotional weight of this moment came from realization. The system had succeeded in preventing collapse, but it had not learned how to encourage renewal. Protection had become default. Exploration had become exception. And over time, that imbalance drained energy from the system. Critics grew louder. They warned that excessive caution would calcify the economy, making it resilient but unresponsive. Supporters countered that slow growth was a fair price for avoiding catastrophe. Both were right, and that was the problem. The conflict was no longer about fear versus greed. It was about balance, about whether a system built to survive shocks could also support transformation, whether safety could coexist with ambition. Pressure mounted as opportunities slipped away, missed investments, delayed innovation, a sense that the future was arriving slower than it should. The system had protected itself from collapse, but it was now vulnerable to stagnation. The buildup was complete. Something had to shift, because a system that cannot fail must also learn how to evolve. And evolution requires risk. The shift came not from crisis, but from reflection. Policymakers, institutions, and investors began to confront an uncomfortable truth. A system optimized solely to prevent collapse would eventually suppress the very dynamism it was meant to protect. Safety had done its job. Now it was time to ask what came next. The climax emerged in a subtle recalibration. Rules were not abandoned, but reinterpreted. Flexibility was reintroduced at the margins. Capital still mattered, but so did intent. Safeguards remained, yet space was carved out for experimentation, for risk taken deliberately rather than accidentally. This was not a return to recklessness. It was an acknowledgement that resilience and growth are not opposites. They are partners. A system strong enough to absorb failure must also allow uncertainty to breathe. Otherwise, protection becomes preservation of the present at the expense of the future. The resolution unfolded gradually. New channels for innovation appeared. Capital began flowing again, cautiously but intentionally. Institutions learned to differentiate between dangerous risk and necessary risk. Stability stopped being the final goal and became the foundation upon which progress could stand. What endured was a deeper understanding of cost. Preventing collapse is essential, but it is not free. It reshapes behavior, incentives, and ambition. The challenge is not choosing between safety and growth, but learning how to hold both at once. The system did not become perfect. It became more honest. Honest about trade-offs. Honest about limits. Honest about the fact that progress requires exposure to uncertainty, even in a world determined to avoid disaster. Because the real price of preventing the next collapse is not measured in rules or capital. It is measured in how much future we are willing to risk to protect the present. So what do you think? Are we sacrificing too much progress to feel safe? The